I thought I'd share this just because it was quite a useful, interesting survey that I did recently. This was a level 2 home buyer survey, so it wasn't any sort of in-depth damp and mould survey. It just happened to have quite a few of the key things that we see on a day-to-day basis. So that explains why I've not gone into too much depth. So this first one that we can see, we've got quite a clearly defined pattern of mould in the corner of a room. So the wall that we're looking directly at is an external wall. The one on our left is the return wall. It's an internal dividing wall. Normally when we see defined edges, it tells us a couple of things. So this area is probably the coolest part of that wall, and it's important to understand why. Sometimes it could be that there's an external defect, for example, leaking guttering or some cracked render or missing pointing, or potentially a cavity wall defect, although it'd be unusual to be in this shape. In this case, I've already done my external checks and there's nothing defective in this particular area. So it's important for us to look a little bit closer to find out what's going on and why this area would be cooler or potentially less well ventilated. So if I move on to the video, we can see a little bit more of the wall. And if we go a little bit closer, one of the first things I can see here looking down is the footprint of a bit of furniture that was quite close against that external wall. And we could almost work out exactly how high this is. So this is probably a full height bit of furniture, much colder at the bottom, very poorly ventilated. We can see all the cobwebs blowing off there. So for this particular survey, it's probably nothing to be worried about, and it is likely to be resolved by the introduction of background heating and ventilation. There's no trickle vents in this room or in any other room, so there's not a great amount of background ventilation. The home has been empty for a little while, but I suspect that this mould has been there for quite a long time, and there's lots of symptoms of it being quite a poorly ventilated home. So moving on, we've got something really similar in the living room. Again, it's an external wall. We can see that really defined shape. There's nothing defective on the outside, no leaks or defects to the external wall itself, but we can see the footprint of a very large piece of furniture that would have been there at the time, and that shape and size of the affected area is exactly in line with where that furniture was, which goes to show what a difference it can make. The other thing is, in this particular home, all of the damp meter readings on every single wall, internal, down low, up high, is consistently 17%, which is relative really, because it's looking at measuring timber, which is in the borderline or at risk range. But it's important to note that that doesn't necessarily mean that there's a damp problem in the classic sense, because it's on all of those walls. This is what we would call the reference reading. So it's the normal level of moisture content for the surfaces in that home. It's still higher than what we would like it to be, but with regular background heating and ventilation, that will probably come down. But what we then have is in the shower, and bear in mind there's not actually any issues visible on the adjacent wall, but we can see that the sealant in this area is not in great condition at all. So I'm using a Tramex ME5 on the mode where it's looking at the depth just behind the tiles. So I did take these readings before turning the shower on as well. So it's still the same, and it's not picking up the actual moisture that's on the surface here. So in a few areas it's showing as dry, but in others it's showing just inside of that damp range, which is around about 22%. So not massively high, but bear in mind this property's been empty for about 6 months. What you can see here, just inside this threshold, the floor there is really spongy. Sometimes that can be age related, but I suspect, given what else I can see, is that has rotten because there's some moisture underneath the lino in that area. And if we go round to the wall that just is behind that shower, again, nothing particularly obvious visually. There's that staining there, but actually something's been spilled against the wall. But the skirting there at low level is showing as just inside the damp range, and the same just around the corner. So bear in mind, this is even with having quite a significant amount of time to dry out. No one's been showering in this room for a long time. The final check that I've done is a quick measurement of the surface of the plaster, which is in a dry range, which says that it's probably an old issue that does still need to be resolved. Most of it's dried out, but it's the timber that's really holding that moisture. So really, really simple fix. It's the reason why we're looking for all of these issues in quite a lot of detail, even on a level 2 survey. Such a small issue, such as that silicon sealant being in poor condition, can lead to very significant issues if it's not dealt with at an early stage. So the final bit here, we can see that this section of wall is painted slightly different. I'm not 100% sure why. I think that that's the most recent bit of paint in this room. We can see that there has been a bit of furniture. You can just see the indents in that corner. But normally if a patch has been painted, it is a little bit of a warning flag. And I've already tested this area, so I'm using the shallow depth mode just so I'm not damaging the finish. This borderline reading is normal for the home, so I'm just moving it around because what I'd already identified is that there was a moisture profile of a particular patch. I'm just trying to find that again. Again, this is all normal, so we keep them moving around. This is about 1 metre from the corner of this wall. To the left is the external wall. This is partly internal, partly external wall. So just getting into that area that's slightly higher, just inside that red zone, which is potentially damp. And we can see that it's just getting into it there. And very, very specific area. If you move 100 millimeters to the right, it disappears again. Doesn't seem to be rising, and you can see a little bit of damaged plaster at the bottom there. So whenever you get anything like that, what we'd normally be doing is going and having a look what's on the other side of that wall, like we did for the shower. Here, what we're going to do is go outside, and the first thing that we can see is we've got this porch, which is really, really close to where the area is. And we can see now that corner is actually exposed. It's an external wall. And it's important to note that this is in an area with high exposure to wind-driven rain, and this is coastal air. So really close to that area, we can see that the external silicon is in quite poor condition. And although it's protected from falling rain, in this particular area, it's going to be vulnerable to driven rain, which could be an access point. If it's not that, the other issue could possibly be that there's a lack of vertical damp-proof membrane on this wall that we're looking at here. So that's a secondary issue. There's also a downpipe there, but it doesn't seem to be a problem in that particular area. So with a lot of what we do, it's staged remedial, staged investigation. I'm not going to be doing the full investigation in this case, but we do try and make sure that our clients will have a generally informed report that will give them a good idea of where to look and what kind of investigation should be carried out if the most simple solutions don't resolve the issue. Again, in this particular case, although that reading is damp, in relation to the rest of the home, it's really only a % change. So it's not massively significant, but we would also always advise on the basis of if there's an obvious defect, it's sensible to try and resolve it. So hopefully you found that useful. I certainly found it a really interesting survey, and it's a good example, hopefully, of following the trail and making sure to not get panicked about high readings, especially when the borderline reference reading is a factor.